You'll never truly be part of this family." The words hung in the air of Evelyn Blackwood's pristine dining room, her voice crisp and cold as the expensive crystal she served wine in. Across the table, I kept my face carefully neutral, the practiced mask I'd perfected over 4 years of marriage to her son. My mother-in-law sipped her Cabernet, the burgundy liquid matching the exact shade of her lipstick. Perfect coordination, always. "I hope I'm making myself clear, Rebecca. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you." "Crystal clear, Evelyn," I replied, cutting a precise piece of roast duck. The knife scraped against the bone china with a sound that made my teeth ache. David, my husband, had stepped outside to take an urgent call from work 15 minutes ago. His impeccable timing for disappearing during his mother's little ambushes never ceased to amaze me. 4 years of marriage, and he still couldn't, or wouldn't, stand between his mother and me. "You come from different circumstances," Evelyn continued, delicately patting her lips with her linen napkin. "The Blackwoods have certain expectations, traditions. Surely you understand. Different circumstances." Her polite euphemism for, "you grew up poor." I swallowed both the duck and my immediate response, which would have ended this facade of a family dinner rather spectacularly. Instead, I smiled. "More. Wine, Evelyn?" Her eyes narrowed slightly at my non-reaction. She preferred when I showed emotion. It gave her ammunition. "No, thank you. One must keep a clear head." The implication that I was somehow intoxicated when I'd barely touched my wine made me want to laugh. If only she knew the truth. If only she knew just how clear-headed I'd been from the very beginning. From the garden, I could hear David's animated voice as he paced the stone path. Through the French doors, I caught glimpses of him gesturing with one hand, his silhouette moving back and forth in the security lighting. He wasn't actually on a work call. I knew the signs by now. The casual stance, the too loud laugh. He was talking to her, Cassandra Porter, the woman he thought I knew nothing about. "Rebecca, are you even listening?" Evelyn's sharp tone cut through my thoughts. "I apologize, Evelyn. You were saying?" I placed my silverware in the perfect 4 o'clock position on my plate, something she'd corrected me on countless times during the early days of my relationship with David. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was saying that the Blackwood family Christmas retreat is for family only. I'm sure you understand. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. David will be expected to attend, of course. The partners at Blackwood and Associates always discuss the coming year's strategy during the hunting weekend. Ah, there it was. The real reason for this dinner. She was uninviting me to the annual family gathering at their Blue Ridge Mountain estate. Again. "Of course, Evelyn, I completely understand." I dabbed my mouth with my napkin. "Family traditions are important." She looked momentarily disappointed by my easy acquiescence. Perhaps she'd been hoping for tears, or at least an argument she could later recount to David as evidence of my emotional instability. "Mother, Rebecca, sorry for stepping away." David breezed back into the dining room, slipping his phone into the pocket of his tailored slacks. His charming smile was firmly in place, the same smile that had once made my heart race. Now I just cataloged it as another performance. What did I miss? "Nothing important, darling," Evelyn replied before I could speak. "Just girl talk." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes at the term. I was 32, with an MBA and a career that had once been on a rapid upward trajectory before I'd put it on hold to support David's advancement at his family's firm. Girl talk was not in my vocabulary. "Actually," I said, meeting David's eyes directly, Your mother was just explaining that the Christmas retreat is family only this year. A flash of something, guilt? Relief? Crossed his face before he composed it into an expression of regret. Oh, well, you know how traditional these business retreats are, honey. It'll be boring strategy sessions and old men telling the same hunting stories. He didn't even try to argue for my inclusion. Not that I'd expected him to. David always chose the path of least resistance when it came to his mother. It's fine, I said lightly. I've been meaning to visit my sister in Colorado. Anyway, this was a lie. My sister Claire and I had already arranged our annual January visit months ago, but it sounded better than admitting I'd be spending Christmas alone in our empty Tudor home in Richmond's most exclusive neighborhood. A home that, Evelyn reminded me at every opportunity, had been in the Blackwood family for generations. "How is Claire?" David asked, clearly relieved by the change of subject. "Still working at that tech startup?" "She's the CFO now, actually." I couldn't keep the pride from my voice. Claire had fought her way up from accounting, working twice as hard as everyone else because, like me, she hadn't had the advantages of an Ivy League education or family connections. "How enterprising," Evelyn commented with the faintest hint of surprise, as though it was shocking that someone from my background could achieve such a position. "She always was the ambitious one," I replied, knowing how Evelyn felt about ambitious women. In her world, a woman's job was to support her husband's career, manage the household with discreet efficiency, and produce suitable heirs. 3 tasks, at which I was apparently failing. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, its sonorous tones echoing through Evelyn's colonial mansion. On cue, David checked his watch with an exaggerated gesture. "We should probably head out, Rebecca." "Early meeting tomorrow." He stood, helping his mother from her chair with practiced gallantry. "Of course, darling." Evelyn patted his cheek. "Don't forget the partners' cocktail reception on Friday. The Hendersons will be there, and they're so looking forward to seeing you." The Hendersons and their daughter Abigail, who just happened to be divorced, childless, and from an old Virginia family with connections that even the Blackwoods envied. How convenient. "I'll be there, Mother." David nodded, then glanced at me. "Rebecca has that charity thing, though." Another event I'd suddenly been uninvited to, apparently. I hadn't mentioned any charity thing to David. "Such a shame," Evelyn said, not looking at all disappointed. "The Hendersons were asking about you both." The 3 of us moved through the familiar choreography of departure. The air kisses, the empty promises to get together soon, the performance of familial warmth for the benefit of Evelyn's housekeeper, who appeared silently to see us out, as I. We walked to the car. David placed his hand at the small of my back. Once that touch would have sent warmth spreading through me. Now it just felt like pressure, keeping me moving, keeping me in line. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" he asked, as we pulled away from his mother's estate, the gravel crunching beneath, the tires of his Range Rover. I didn't answer immediately, watching the security gates close behind us in the side mirror. The ornate wrought iron had always reminded me of a cage. "Rebecca?" David prompted, his tone carrying the edge it always did when I didn't immediately smooth things over. It was fine. I turned to look out the passenger window, not trusting my expression to match my words. "Same as always," he sighed, that put-upon sound I'd grown to hate. "She's trying, in her way." "Is she?" I asked mildly. "You know how important family is to her, to all the Blackwoods." I did know. I'd heard about the sacred importance of family since the day I'd met Evelyn. Family was her justification for everything, for meddling in our lives, for her constant criticism of me, for David's inability to set boundaries. "And yet I'll never be family," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She didn't mean it like that." "How did she mean it then?" "You're putting words in her mouth." Those were her exact words, David. You'll never truly be part of this family. While you were outside on your call. He didn't respond to that, just flicked on his turn signal with unnecessary force as we approached the highway entrance. We drove in silence for several minutes, the soft hum of the luxury vehicle filling the space where conversation should have been. She's from a different generation, he finally said, his standard excuse for his mother's behavior. She doesn't always express herself well. I almost laughed at that. Evelyn Blackwood, with her master's in art history from Vassar, unable to express herself? The woman who served on the boards of 3 major cultural institutions and chaired the Historical Society's annual gala? She knew exactly how to express herself and exactly what effect her words would have. "Let's not fight about this again," David said, reaching over to squeeze my hand briefly before returning it to the wheel. "It's not worth it." Not worth it. That was the crux of the issue, wasn't it? Standing up for me, for us, wasn't worth the discomfort of confronting his mother. My feelings weren't worth the potential disruption to his carefully ordered life. I looked at his profile in the dim light of the dashboard, the strong jaw, the aristocratic nose, the perfectly coiffed hair already showing distinguished touches of silver at 36. He was still handsome, still the man who'd swept me off, my feet at that gallery opening in New York. But now I could see what I hadn't then, the weakness around his mouth, the avoiding eyes, the way he'd been carefully molded into the perfect Blackwood heir. "You're right," I said, turning back to the window. "It's not worth it." He relaxed visibly, mistaking my resignation for agreement. That was David's particular talent, hearing only what he wanted to hear. The rest of the drive passed in silence, broken only by the occasional ping of his phone. He didn't check it, but I knew who it was. Cassandra. Waiting for confirmation that he'd be seeing her Friday, no doubt, while I attended my non-existent charity thing. We pulled into the circular driveway of our home, the ancestral Blackwood residence that had been David's childhood home before Evelyn had moved to her current estate following his father's death. The imposing Tudor stood dark and quiet, its leaded glass windows reflecting nothing but our headlights as we approached. Home. That was what David called it. I'd never felt less at home anywhere in my life. As we walked up the slate path to the front door, David's phone pinged again. This time he pulled it out, glancing at the screen with poorly concealed interest. "Harrison needs me to review some documents before the meeting tomorrow," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I'll be in the study for a while." Harrison, his assistant, who apparently worked at 10 p.m., or rather, whose name David used when he wanted to talk to Cassandra without interruption. "Take your time," I replied, hanging my coat in the closet. "I have some work to finish up as well." He looked relieved, already loosening his tie as he headed toward his study. "Don't wait up." I watched him go, wondering when exactly we'd become these people. These strangers sharing a house, going through the motions of a marriage. Had it been gradual, or had we always been this way and I just hadn't wanted to see it? I climbed the curved staircase to the second floor, my heels silent on the thick carpet. Passing the closed door of David's study, I heard his low laugh, the genuine one, not the tight social chuckle he used at his mother's functions. He was already on the phone with her. In our bedroom, separate from his for the past year, ostensibly, because of his early morning calls and my light sleeping. I kicked off my heels and unzipped my dress, the designer garment sliding to the floor in a puddle of midnight blue silk. One of many such dresses hanging in my closet, all purchased to meet Evelyn's exacting standards for a Blackwood wife's appearance. I stepped into the ensuite bathroom, removing my makeup with methodical care, watching my face emerge from beneath. The perfect mask I wore for Evelyn's dinners. Without the carefully applied cosmetics, I looked younger. More like the woman David had met 5 years ago. The ambitious financial analyst who'd caught his eye at her first major gallery showing in Manhattan. Back then, I'd been climbing the ranks at Meridian Capital, making a name for myself in a male-dominated field. I'd been confident, driven, unapologetically myself. David had said that was what attracted him. My independence, my unwillingness to be intimidated by his family name or fortune. "You're nothing like the women I usually meet," he'd said on our third date, in a small jazz club in the village. "You don't care who my family is." I hadn't then. The Blackwoods meant nothing to me, just another old-money East Coast family with more history than relevance. I'd grown up in Colorado, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to put my sister and me through college. The kind of entrenched privilege the Blackwoods represented had been as foreign to me as the surface of Mars. I should have realized, of course, that what attracted David initially would eventually become the very thing his mother would try to eradicate in me. Independence had no place in the Blackwood family structure. Slipping into my silk pajamas, I moved to the window seat overlooking the back gardens. The moon illuminated the carefully manicured lawns, the heritage rose garden, the stone pathways, winding between centuries-old oak trees. Beautiful, perfect, and cold, like everything in the Blackwood world. I pulled out my tablet from the bedside drawer, entering the long passcode that David would never guess. It wasn't that I was hiding anything illegal, just private. The one remaining piece of myself I hadn't surrendered to the Blackwood assimilation process. The secure email account opened, showing 3 new messages. 2 from my financial advisor, 1 from my sister. I opened Claire's first. "All set for January. The paperwork came through. Call me when you can talk privately." Short and to the point, typical Claire. I'd call her tomorrow from my car, the only place I was certain David couldn't overhear. The Blackwood legacy didn't include respect for privacy. Next, I opened the messages from Michael, my financial advisor, and the only person besides Claire who knew what I'd been planning for the past 18 months. Transfer complete. Final documents ready for signature. Meeting confirmed for December 23rd. The second email contained only attachments, financial statements, transfer confirmations, legal documents. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. While David thought I was managing charitable donations and planning dinner parties, I'd been carefully orchestrating my exit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Evelyn had always looked down on my financial career, suggesting repeatedly that a Blackwood wife had no need for such concerns. "That's what husbands and family accountants are for, dear," she'd said shortly after our wedding. But my financial expertise was exactly what had allowed me to see the truth about the Blackwood fortune, and about the very house we were living. 3 years ago, while organizing David's home office at his request, I'd come across documents that didn't make sense. Property deeds, loan agreements, transfer records that didn't align with what I knew about the Blackwood holdings. At first, I'd assumed it was just poor record-keeping, but something had nagged at me, so I dug deeper, carefully, methodically. Using skills I'd honed over years in financial analysis, what I'd discovered had changed everything. The great Blackwood fortune was largely smoke and mirrors. Generations of poor management, risky investments, and lavish spending had whittled away what had once been a substantial empire. The family firm, Blackwood and Associates, was staying afloat through a complex shell game that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. And this house, the ancestral Blackwood home that Evelyn lorded over me, wasn't even theirs. The property had been mortgaged to the hilt and then sold through a complicated series of transactions to a holding company to avoid losing it outright during a financial crisis 20 years ago. The Blackwoods merely leased it back through another company to maintain appearances. The morning light filtered through the leaded glass windows, casting diamond patterns across the antique Persian rug. I'd been awake for hours, reviewing documents, and finalizing arrangements while David slept in his separate bedroom down the hall. His soft snores had stopped about 20 minutes ago, signaling he'd soon emerge, perfectly pressed and oblivious, ready for another day of pretending to run the family firm. I closed my laptop as I heard his shower start. By the time he made his way downstairs, I was already in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand and another waiting for him on the counter. "You're up early," he observed, reaching for the coffee. He was wearing the charcoal gray Brioni suit I'd given him for his birthday last year. The one he'd said was exactly what I wanted, in that distracted tone that meant he hadn't really noticed or cared. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, not mentioning that his late-night phone conversation with Cassandra had been clearly audible through the wall. Our house might be grand, but its centuries-old walls weren't soundproofed for modern indiscretions. "About last night," he began, stirring precisely 1 teaspoon of raw sugar into his coffee. "I think you misunderstood my mother." I bit back a sigh. Of course we were doing this now, at 7:30 a.m., when he had exactly 12 minutes before he needed to leave for his first meeting. Just enough time to gaslight me, not enough for a real conversation. Did I? I kept my tone neutral, watching him over the rim of my mug. "She values you in her way. She's just protective of family traditions." Protective. I nodded as though this was a reasonable description of Evelyn's behavior. "And these traditions require my absence at Christmas." David checked his watch, the vintage Patek Philippe that had been his grandfather's. "It's not personal, Rebecca. The retreat has always been about business strategy first. The wives don't usually attend the working sessions." "Except for your Aunt Margaret," I pointed out. "And your cousin Eliza." He frowned slightly. "That's different. Margaret is on the board, and Eliza works directly with our Asia clients. And I have an MBA from Columbia and 6 years of experience in financial strategy. But that's irrelevant?" "You chose to step back from your career," he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Nobody forced you to give up your job at Meridian." No, nobody had forced me. Just strongly suggested, repeatedly. By both David and Evelyn, with their comments about the demands of my hours, the travel, the unfeminine aggression of financial workplaces. They had worn me down until taking a sabbatical seemed like the only way to save my marriage. "You're right," I said, surprising him. "It was my choice, just like what I was planning now was my choice." His expression softened, mistaking my agreement for capitulation. "I promise I'll make it up to you after the holidays. Maybe that trip to Bali you've been wanting? A trip that would inevitably be canceled due to some urgent Blackwood business, just like our last 3 planned vacations. That would be nice." I glanced at the antique clock on the kitchen wall. "You'd better get going. Wasn't your meeting with Henderson at 8? "Right." He drained his coffee and set the cup in the sink, never in the dishwasher, because that was apparently my job, even though we had a housekeeper 3 times a week. "Don't forget the dry cleaning. My blue suit needs to be ready for the Henderson. Dinner? I'll take care of it." Another task for the invisible wife. I followed him to the front door, maintaining the fiction of our happy marriage all the way through his perfunctory goodbye kiss. As soon as his Range Rover disappeared down the driveway, I dropped the act. The practiced smile fell away, replaced by focused determination. I had 3 hours before I needed to meet with Michael to finalize the last of the arrangements, and a lot to accomplish first. First, I called Claire from the secure line in my home office, formerly the ladies' sitting room, when the house had been built in 1897, and the only place in the house where I'd replaced all the electronics myself, ensuring nothing was connected to the Blackwood family's shared cloud accounts. "Hey, sis?" Claire answered on the second ring. "Secure line?" "Yes." I moved to the window, scanning the garden out of habit. But of course, no one was there. The household staff wouldn't arrive until 10, and David was safely ensconced in his corner office downtown. "Everything's proceeding as planned." "Good. I've got the Colorado paperwork ready. The LLC is established and the property transfers are set up. Just need your final signature on the closing documents. I'll be there on the 23rd, ostensibly to start my Christmas visit early." Claire paused, and I could picture her sitting at her glass desk in her Denver loft, brow furrowed in concern. "Are you sure about the timing? Christmas seems poetic," I supplied. "Fitting, the perfect bookend to last Christmas, when Evelyn announced to the entire family that my barren condition was the greatest disappointment of her life." I was going to say emotionally complicated, but sure, let's go with poetic. Claire's voice softened. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." I straightened a stack of papers on my desk. Financial projections for the Blackwood firm that David had asked me to review when I had time. They confirmed what I already knew. The company was in serious trouble, papering over losses with increasingly creative accounting. Just ready for this to be over. And David still has no idea? None. I moved to my computer, pulling up the surveillance footage from the security system I'd installed when David started coming home with unexplained late nights. The cameras had captured plenty of evidence of his relationship with Cassandra, enough to ensure that the infidelity clauses in our prenuptial agreement were thoroughly invalidated. He still thinks I'm just the trophy wife who gave up her career to support his. His loss, Claire said firmly. Literally, in this case. We finalized a few more details before ending the call. Claire, ever the pragmatic CFO, had helped me structure everything to be unassailable. The property acquisitions, the financial transfers, the new identity I'd established for my post-Blackwood life. Not illegal, just private, and very, very secure. After ending the call, I opened my closet and selected a Chanel suit in deep burgundy, Evelyn's least favorite color on me, which was precisely why I'd chosen it for today's meeting with Michael. Small rebellions had kept me sane these past years. The drive into downtown Richmond gave me time to reflect on how I'd reached this point. 5 years ago, I'd been rising through the ranks at Meridian Capital in New York, making a name for myself, with my analytical skills and strategic thinking. Then I'd met David at a gallery opening, handsome, charming, from a good family, as my mother would have said. Our whirlwind romance had seemed like something from a fairy tale. He'd pursued me with an intensity that had been flattering, overwhelming. Weekend trips to the Berkshires, surprise gifts, candlelit dinners at restaurants with month-long waiting lists. When he'd proposed after just 6 months, I'd said yes, without hesitation. The warning signs had been there, of course. His reluctance to introduce me to his mother until after we were engaged. The way he'd deferred to her opinion on everything from our wedding venue to our honeymoon destination. His casual dismissal of my career ambitions as something I'd grow out of once we started a family. But I'd been in love and convinced I could handle Evelyn Blackwood. After all, I'd navigated the shark-infested waters of Wall Street finance. How difficult could one traditional Southern mother-in-law be? Monumentally difficult, as it turned out. From the moment we'd met, Evelyn had made it her mission to remind me of my inadequacies. My background, not from old money. My education, scholarship student, how quaint. My career, so aggressive for a woman. My fashion sense, too New York. My entertaining style, too informal. My childlessness, a personal failure, obviously. For the first 2 years I'd tried. I'd hosted her approved dinner parties. I'd joined her approved committees. I'd redecorated our home to her approved standards. I'd even put my career on pause to focus on being the perfect Blackwood wife. But nothing had been enough. And David, caught between his mother and his wife, had chosen the path of least resistance, placating both of us with half-promises and deflections, retreating further into his work, and eventually into Cassandra's eager arms. I pulled into the private garage beneath Michael's office building, using the dedicated elevator that led directly to his suite. Michael Green had been my advisor since my early days at Meridian, one of the few senior partners who'd treated me as a protege, rather than a diversity hire. When I'd discovered the truth about the Blackwood finances, he was the only person outside my family I'd trusted with the information. Rebecca. He stood as I entered his office, coming around his desk to greet me with a warm handshake. At 62, Michael radiated the calm confidence of a man who'd seen every financial trick in the book and was rarely surprised anymore. "Right on time, as always, Michael." I took the offered seat across from his desk, setting my portfolio on my lap. "I trust everything is in order?" "Completely." He returned to his chair, pulling up documents on his screen. "The final property transfer was recorded yesterday. The holding company is now the official owner of record, and all the paperwork has been filed with the county?" I nodded, a curious mix of emotions washing through me. Relief, anticipation, and an unexpected twinge of sadness. Not for the marriage I was leaving, that had been effectively over for years, but for the dreams I'd once had of what life with David might be. "And there's no way to trace it back to me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. We'd constructed the ownership chain meticulously, using a series of LLCs and trusts that would take a team of forensic accountants months to unravel. "None." Michael smiled slightly. "The irony is that we used the same structure the Blackwoods employed 20 years ago when they were trying to hide their financial troubles. They created the blueprint we followed." Fitting. I opened my portfolio, removing the final documents I needed to sign. "And the timing? Everything is set to trigger on December 24th at 9 a.m. The Blackwoods will receive formal notification of the change in ownership, along with the new lease terms. New lease terms that would increase their rent by 300%, with payment due immediately. An impossible sum for a family secretly teetering on the edge of financial ruin? And David's personal accounts?" Michael's expression turned more serious. "As you predicted, he's been moving funds to offshore accounts for the past 3 months. Small amounts, trying to stay under reporting thresholds. If I had to guess, I'd say he's planning an exit of his own." I wasn't surprised. David's late-night conversations, his increased secretiveness, the documents he thought I hadn't noticed him removing from his study, all pointed to someone preparing to abandon ship. Probably planning to disappear with Cassandra once the Blackwood financial house of cards finally collapsed. "Has he accessed our joint accounts?" "Tried and failed." Michael looked pleased with himself. "The security protocols you put in place last year prevented the transfers he attempted last week. He likely assumes it's just a bank error." I nodded, signing the last of the documents with a steady hand. "And the evidence of his infidelity?" "All properly documented and verified by the private investigator. The prenup's fidelity clause is thoroughly triggered. Your separate assets are protected, and you're entitled to the settlement terms you negotiated. A settlement that included a substantial cash payment, money the Blackwoods didn't actually have, which would force them to liquidate what few remaining legitimate assets they possessed. Some might call it vindictive. I called it justice. Thank you, Michael." I handed him the signed papers, our fingers briefly touching in a gesture of solidarity. "For everything. You were always my most brilliant student, Rebecca." His eyes crinkled with genuine affection. "The Blackwoods never deserved you." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time since discovering the truth about the Blackwoods, I was taking active steps to free myself from their web of lies and manipulations. No more pretending, no more compromising, no more diminishing myself to fit into their narrow definition of wifely value. The rest of the day passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated normalcy. I collected David's dry cleaning, approved the menu for a dinner party we'd never actually host, and made an appearance at the women's auxiliary luncheon where Evelyn and her friends held court. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, playing the role of devoted Blackwood wife one last time. That evening, David called to say he'd be working late. Again. "The Henderson account needs attention," he explained, his voice carrying that artificial note of regret I'd come to recognize. "Don't wait up." Of course. I kept my tone neutral, neither accusing nor encouraging. "Will you be home for breakfast?" Probably. Not. Early meeting tomorrow. I understand. Good luck with the Hendersons. As I ended the call, I wondered if he was even trying to come up with believable lies anymore. The Henderson account had been closed 3 months ago. I'd seen the termination paperwork when I was organizing David's home office. Tonight, like many nights before, he'd be with Cassandra in her downtown apartment, thinking he was getting away with something. Let him enjoy these last few weeks of deception. Soon enough, his entire world would implode. I spent the evening finalizing details for my departure. My personal items, the ones that actually mattered to me, not the designer clothes and jewelry David and Evelyn had selected to make me a suitable Blackwood wife, had already been quietly shipped to a storage facility in Denver. My most important documents were secured in a safe deposit box under my maiden name. My exit strategy was flawless. Just after midnight, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number, one of several burner phones I'd established for secure communications. Eagle. Has landed. Nest secure. Awaiting confirmation for December 23rd extraction. The message was from Antoine, the security specialist Claire had connected me with. Former military, now running a private firm specializing in high-risk exits for wealthy clients leaving dangerous relationships. Not that David had ever been physically abusive. His weapons were psychological, emotional, the slow erosion of self-worth rather than the bruising of flesh. I sent back a simple reply. Confirmed. Standard protocol, slipping the phone back into its hiding place inside a hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice, the one book in our library Evelyn would never touch, dismissing Austen as simplistic female fantasy. I moved to the window. The Blackwood estate sprawled before me, moonlight silvering the ancient oaks and manicured lawns. Such a perfect facade, hiding so much rot beneath. 2 more weeks. That was all I needed to maintain this charade, to keep playing the role of Rebecca, Blackwood, dutiful wife and failed addition to the family legacy. 2 more weeks until I reclaimed myself completely. My phone, my regular phone, buzzed with an incoming call. David. It was nearly 1 a.m. Hello? I answered, injecting a sleepy quality into my voice. Rebecca. His voice was tight, controlled. In that way it got when he was angry but trying not to show it. Did you talk to the Hendersons? I blinked in genuine confusion. The Hendersons? No. Why would I? Because somehow they knew about the Richardson merger. Information that was strictly confidential. The Richardson merger, the desperate attempt to save Blackwood and Associates by merging with their main competitor. A move that would effectively end Blackwood control of the company that bore their name. I'd discovered the negotiations months ago when David carelessly left documents on his desk. I haven't spoken to the Hendersons in weeks, David. Not since the charity auction. Someone told them. And now Richardson is reconsidering the terms. The strain in his voice told me more than his words. Without the Richardson merger, Blackwood and Associates would collapse within months. The House of Cards was already wobbling. Maybe it was someone at Richardson, I suggested mildly. These things rarely stay secret for long. It wasn't Richardson. His tone was accusatory. The Hendersons specifically mentioned that they heard it from family sources. That means either mother or you. I sat up straighter, his implied accusation hitting a nerve. And naturally you assume it was me? Not your mother who's been friends with Margaret Henderson for 30 years? My mother understands what's at stake here. And I don't? I kept my voice even, though anger simmered just below the surface. David, I had no idea you were even meeting with the Hendersons tonight. You told me you were working late on their account, not meeting them personally. A telling silence followed. He'd caught himself in his own lie. That's not the point, he finally said, backpedaling. The point is that Richardson is wavering, and if this merger falls through, the firm will be in serious trouble. I finished. For him. I understand business consequences, David. I was a financial analyst, remember? Before I became just a Blackwood wife. Don't start with that again. His sigh crackled through the phone connection. I'm under enough pressure without you turning this into another conversation about your career. I bit back my first response, which would have escalated the argument further. That wasn't in my playbook anymore. Every interaction now was carefully calculated, every reaction measured against my end goal. You're right, I said instead. This isn't about me. What does your legal team say about Richardson's hesitation? My sudden pivot to practical matters caught him off guard. They think we can salvage it. Up the offering price, maybe? I have another meeting with them tomorrow morning. I'm sure you'll figure it out, I offered. The perfect supportive wife statement. Empty but reassuring. Yeah. He seemed deflated now, his anger giving way to the weight of his situation. Sorry for calling so late. And for accusing me of sabotaging his company, for lying about his whereabouts, for the 1,000 small betrayals that had become our marriage. It's fine, I said, because that's what I always said. Get some rest. Things will look better in the morning. After we hung up, I lay back against my pillows, staring at the elaborate plasterwork ceiling. David's call had inadvertently confirmed what I'd suspected. The Blackwood financial empire was crumbling faster than even I had anticipated. The Richardson merger was their last hope, a desperate Hail Mary to maintain the illusion of prosperity, and it was apparently already in jeopardy. Part of me, a small, vindictive part I wasn't particularly proud of, wanted to enjoy watching them scramble. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the manipulations, tired of the Blackwood obsession with appearances over substance. 2 more weeks, I reminded myself. 2 more weeks of playing along, and then I'd be free. Morning arrived with a crystalline December. Clarity, sunlight refracting through frost-edged windows. David hadn't come home at all, not even to change clothes. Another piece of evidence for my growing file. I went through my morning routine with practiced efficiency, then headed downstairs to find Evelyn sitting at our kitchen island, impeccably, dressed in a St. John knit suit, sipping from one of my grandmother's antique teacups. Evelyn. I managed to mask my surprise, maintaining a neutral expression. I didn't realize you were coming by this morning. Clearly. Her gaze swept over my silk pajamas and robe, perfectly respectable attire for a woman in her own home at 7:30 a.m., but apparently not up to Blackwood standards for receiving unexpected mother-in-law visits. I would have dressed if I'd known. You were coming, I said mildly, moving to the coffee maker. David didn't mention you'd be stopping by. David doesn't know I'm here. She set down her teacup with a delicate clink. This is between you and me, Rebecca. A conversation between Evelyn and me without David as a buffer? This was unprecedented in our 4-year history. I see. I poured my coffee, taking my time, refusing to show the unease her presence triggered. What can I help you with? You can explain why you've been meeting with Michael Green. The cup stilled halfway to my lips. How did she know about Michael? I'd been extraordinarily careful, using back entrances, secure communications, meetings scheduled during times when the Blackwood sphere of influence should have been occupied. Elsewhere. I took a slow sip before responding, using the moment to compose my thoughts. Michael has been my financial advisor for years, Evelyn. Since before I met David. A fact you neglected to mention when you joined our family. I wasn't aware I needed to provide a complete list of my professional relationships. Her lips thinned. You do when those relationships intersect with family interests. And how exactly does my financial advisor intersect with Blackwood interests? I leaned against the counter, projecting a confidence I didn't entirely feel. The kitchen suddenly seemed smaller, the air between us charged with unspoken accusations. Don't play. Naive, Rebecca. It doesn't suit you. Evelyn stood, smoothing her already immaculate skirt. Michael Green was investigated by the SEC for his role in the Meridian Capital scandal 5 years ago. An investigation that found no wrongdoing on his part, I pointed out. No charges doesn't mean no wrongdoing. It just means he was careful. She moved closer, her perfume, Creed, always Creed, enveloping me in its suffocating cloud of old money. What I want to know is what you're planning. Planning? I arched an eyebrow, the picture of innocence. I'm not planning anything, Evelyn. Just managing my personal finances, which have nothing to do with Blackwood interests. Everything a Blackwood wife does reflects on the family, she countered. Especially now, when David is navigating sensitive business matters. The Richardson merger. She knew it was in trouble. If you're concerned about the merger, I said, deciding to meet her head-on, you should talk to David. I'm not involved in Blackwood business decisions. A flash of something, surprise, perhaps respect, crossed her features before she composed them into her usual mask of disapproval. So, you know about Richardson. I'm married to the heir of Blackwood and Associates. Of course I know about Major Chi, business developments. And have you discussed these developments with Michael Green? The question was pointed, her gaze sharp. My conversations with Michael are about my personal portfolio, Evelyn. Nothing more. This, at least, was technically true. We discussed the Blackwood finances only in terms of how they would affect my exit strategy. She studied me for a long moment, as if trying to peer through my skin to the thoughts beneath. I've always known you were ambitious, Rebecca. It's one of the qualities that made you unsuitable as a Blackwood wife. But ambition can be dangerous when misdirected. Is that a threat? A observation. She retrieved her purse from the counter, a vintage Hermes Kelly in a shade of burgundy that exactly matched her lipstick. Family protects its own, Rebecca. Remember that. The irony of her statement, after years of making it clear I would never be family, was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. I'll keep that in mind. I remained in place as she moved toward the door. Anything else I should remember, Evelyn? She paused, looking back over her shoulder with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. The Christmas retreat begins on the 23rd. I've arranged for David to arrive early for some private family discussions. You might want to adjust your schedule accordingly. With that parting shot, she was gone, the door closing behind her with barely a sound. I stood motionless in the kitchen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The 23rd. The exact day I was scheduled to leave for Colorado. The exact day Antoine was supposed to extract me from the Blackwood web. Coincidence? Or had something in my careful planning been detected? I reached for my phone. My regular phone, not the secure one, and dialed David's office number. Blackwood and Associates, David Blackwood's office. His assistant answered smoothly. Margaret, it's Rebecca. Is David available? I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwood, he's in meetings all morning. Can I have him return your call? Please. Just let him know I need to confirm our schedules for the 23rd. His mother mentioned he might be leaving early for the retreat. Oh! Margaret sounded surprised. I didn't have that on his calendar. Let me check with him and get back to you. So Evelyn hadn't discussed this with David yet. Interesting. Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate it. After hanging up, I immediately moved to my secure phone, sending a coded message to Antoine. Potential timeline acceleration required. Stand by for details. Then I texted Claire. Call me. Secure line. Possible complication. 20 minutes later, I was in my car, driving toward the small coffee shop across town where I could speak freely without risking Blackwood surveillance. The place was a hole in the wall that no self-respecting Blackwood would ever enter, making it perfect for my purposes. Claire answered my secure call on the first ring. What's happening? Evelyn came to the house this morning. She knows about Michael. Shit. Claire rarely cursed. The fact that she did now indicated how serious this was. How much does she know? Unclear. She made veiled references to my ambition and warned me that family protects its own. And she's trying to get David to the retreat early, on the 23rd, the day you're supposed to leave. Claire was silent for a moment, and I could picture her rapid mental calculations. We need to move up the timeline. Agreed. But I need to be careful. If I change plans too suddenly, it might confirm whatever suspicions Evelyn already has. What about the property transfer? Is it ready to trigger? Yes. Everything's in place. It's just a matter of setting the date. Do it tomorrow, Claire said decisively. Better to move while they're still trying to figure out what you're planning, rather than waiting until they know. And my exit? I'll call Antoine. We can have you out by tomorrow night. The paperwork can be handled remotely. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 4 years of planning suddenly compressing into less than 48 hours. Okay, I'll contact Michael and set things in motion. Be careful, Becca. Claire's voice softened with concern. The Blackwoods didn't get where they are by being stupid. If Evelyn suspects something, she won't stop me, I said with quiet determination. I've come too far. After ending the call, I sat in my car for several minutes, recalibrating my mental timeline. Everything I'd carefully arranged over years was now accelerated to a breakneck pace. The margin for error had just shrunk drastically. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Mother mentioned Christmas retreat. Not planning to leave early. Working. On Richardson's situation. Talk tonight. So Evelyn had lied about David's early departure. A test, perhaps? Or a ploy to disrupt whatever she thought I was planning. Either way, it confirmed my instinct to accelerate. The Blackwoods were circling, sensing a threat but not yet able to identify it. I started my car and headed directly to Michael's office, taking a circuitous route and checking frequently for any sign of surveillance. Paranoid, perhaps. But the Blackwoods had resources and connections throughout Richmond. Better safe than sorry. Michael was surprised to see me without an appointment, but ushered me into his private office immediately. We need to move up the timeline, I said without preamble. Evelyn knows we're meeting. His eyebrows shot up. How? Unknown. But she came to the house this morning to warn me about my ambition and remind me that family protects its own. Typical. Blackwood intimidation tactics. Michael moved to his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard. How soon do you want to trigger the property transfer? Tomorrow. He paused, looking up at me. That's aggressive. The notification letters are prepared for the 24th. The legal team will need to... Can it be done or not, Michael? I cut in, my voice sharper than intended. It can be done, he assured me. But you need to be prepared for immediate fallout. Once the Blackwoods receive notification of the ownership change, they'll mobilize every resource they have. Legal challenges, personal attacks, possibly even attempts to freeze your assets. Let them try. I pulled out my secure phone, sending another coded message to Antoine. Confirmation for accelerated timeline. Tomorrow night. Rebecca. Michael's tone made me look up. His expression was grave. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once we trigger the transfer, there's no turning back. The Blackwoods will never forgive what they'll see as betrayal. I thought about Evelyn's cold dismissal of me over 4 years. David's gradual abandonment as he retreated into work and Cassandra's arms. The systematic dismantling of my confidence, my career, my sense of self. They've never seen me as family, Michael. Just an interloper who needed to be managed and eventually discarded. I met his eyes steadily. I'm not betraying them. I'm just beating them to the punch. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I'll set everything in motion. The transfer will execute at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Notification will be delivered to Blackwood and Associates and to the family residences simultaneously. And my accounts? Already secured. The moment the transfer executes, your personal funds will be moved to the new accounts we established, untraceable and completely separate from anything connected to the Blackwoods. Thank you, Michael. I stood, suddenly feeling the weight of years of planning, of pretending, of waiting for this moment. For everything. Just be careful for the next 24 hours, he warned. Don't give them any reason to suspect what's coming. I left his office through the private elevator, emerged into the parking garage, and sat in my car for several minutes, focusing on my breathing. After 4 years of careful planning, of methodically assembling the pieces of my escape while maintaining the perfect facade of a Blackwood wife, the endgame was finally here. One more day of pretending. One more day of being Rebecca Blackwood, the disappointment, the outsider, the woman who would never truly be family. Then I would show them exactly who I really was. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, its sonorous tones echoing through the empty house. I sat in David's study, a room I rarely entered when he was home, methodically going through his files one last time. Not to gather evidence. I already had everything I needed. This was about making sure I hadn't missed anything that might come back to haunt me. My phone buzzed with a text from Antoine. Extraction confirmed. 10 p.m. tomorrow, standard protocol. I sent back a simple acknowledgement, then returned to my task. The Richardson merger documents were spread before me, revealing the desperate measures the Blackwoods were taking to save their sinking corporate ship. The terms were heavily weighted. In Richardson's favor, they were essentially acquiring Blackwood and Associates for pennies on the dollar, while allowing the Blackwood name to remain on the letterhead as a face-saving gesture. No wonder David was stressed. This wasn't a merger. It was a surrender disguised as a strategic partnership. I took photos of the key pages, encrypting them to my secure cloud storage. Not because I planned to use them. I had no interest in corporate espionage, but because knowledge was protection. If the Blackwoods came after me, I wanted every possible shield. The front door opened and closed, followed by the familiar sound of David's footsteps in the hallway. He wasn't supposed to be home tonight. Another late meeting had been the excuse. Yet here he was at midnight, and from the uneven cadence of his steps, he'd been drinking. I quickly restored the files to their original order and shut down my tablet. By the time the study door opened, I was sitting calmly in his leather chair, a single desk lamp illuminating the room. Rebecca? David stood in the doorway, his tie askew, confusion evident on his face. What are you doing in here? Waiting. For you? I kept my voice neutral, studying him. His normally impeccable appearance was distinctly rumpled, and there was a smudge of lipstick on his collar, not even trying to hide it anymore. I thought you had a late meeting. It finished early. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. Why are you waiting in my study? We need to talk about Christmas. I stood, smoothing my silk robe. And about what your mother said this morning. He blinked, clearly caught off guard. My mother? What did she say? She came by the house. Didn't she tell you? No. He frowned, moving further into the room and dropping his briefcase on the desk. What did she want? To warn me, apparently, about my ambition being misdirected. David's expression shifted, wariness replacing confusion. What does that mean? You tell me, David. I moved around the desk, maintaining a careful distance between us. She seems to think I'm some kind of threat to the family. He loosened his tie completely, pulling it off and dropping it on the desk. She's just protective. You know how she gets. Protective of what, exactly? The family name? The family secrets? I paused, watching his reaction closely. The family finances? His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. Just trying to understand why your mother felt the need to deliver cryptic warnings about family loyalty while you're supposedly working late on the Richardson merger. How do you know about Richardson? His voice had taken on an edge. You mentioned it last night, remember? When you called to accuse me of leaking information to the Hendersons? His shoulders relaxed slightly. Right, I was under a lot of pressure? Clearly. I nodded toward the lipstick stain on his collar. Is that what they're calling it these days? Pressure? David's hand went to his collar, his expression cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally settling on defensiveness. It's not what you think. It never is. I moved toward the door, suddenly tired of the charade. Go to bed, David. We both know you're going to sleep in the guest room anyway. Rebecca. He reached for my arm, but I sidestepped his grasp. Save it. I paused at the doorway, looking back at him, this man I'd once loved enough to uproot my life for. Whatever story you're about to tell, I don't want to hear it. Not tonight. I left him standing there, surrounded by the trappings of Blackwood prestige, the antique desk that had belonged to his great-grandfather, the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, the shelves of leather-bound books that I doubted he'd ever read. All symbols of a legacy that was crumbling beneath the weight of its own pretensions. In my bedroom, I locked the door. Something I'd started doing months ago when David's late-night returns sometimes included attempts at drunken reconciliation. Tonight, especially, I needed the barrier between us. Tomorrow, everything would change, and I couldn't risk a moment of weakness, of nostalgia for what might have been. I pulled out my secure phone, checking for updates from Claire and Antoine. Everything was proceeding according to the accelerated timeline. By this time tomorrow night, I'd be on a private plane to Denver, leaving the Blackwood name and all its associated burdens behind. Sleep eluded me as I ran through mental checklists, anticipating potential complications, reviewing contingency plans. So much could still go wrong. The Blackwoods had resources, connections, influence. Once they realized what was happening, they would marshal everything at their disposal to counter me. But I had the advantage of surprise, and of knowing exactly how the Blackwood empire was structured, all its weaknesses, its pressure points, its carefully hidden vulnerabilities. Dawn was breaking when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains I'd never liked but had installed, because Evelyn insisted they were appropriate for a Blackwood residence. The alarm woke me at 7 a.m. I showered and dressed with deliberate care, selecting a conservative St. John suit in navy, the perfect Blackwood wife attire for a Wednesday in December. Nothing that would signal today was different from any other day. Downstairs, I was surprised to find David in the kitchen, already dressed for work and making coffee. This deviation from our normal routine, where he typically slept late after his late meetings, put me immediately on alert. You're up early, I observed, keeping my tone casual as I reached for a mug. Couldn't sleep. He didn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on stirring his coffee with unnecessary attention. About last night, it's fine, I cut him off, not wanting to navigate another round of excuses and half apologies. We both said things we didn't mean. He looked up, relief evident in his expression. So we're okay? We're fine. I checked my watch. 8:15 a.m. 45 minutes until the property transfer executed. Don't you have that meeting with Richardson today? It's been pushed to this afternoon. He took a sip of his coffee, studying me over the rim of his mug. Mother wants to see us for lunch, both of us. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Today? I have appointments. She was very insistent. David's tone carried that note of finality it always did when relaying Evelyn's demands. She says it's important. Family business. Family business. The Blackwood code for something too sensitive to discuss over the phone. "What time?" I asked, already calculating how to adjust my exit strategy. 12:30, at her house. That would put us at Evelyn's estate right when the notification letters were scheduled to be delivered. Not ideal, but perhaps useful. I could witness their reactions firsthand. "I'll move some things around," I conceded, turning away to hide. The tension I couldn't quite mask. "But I can't stay long. I have a meeting with the Historical Society at 2. Another lie, but one that provided a plausible excuse to leave Evelyn's house before the situation escalated too far. "Thank you." David's relief was palpable. "Mother will appreciate it." I doubted Evelyn had ever genuinely appreciated anything I'd done, but I simply nodded, focusing on preparing my own coffee. "Will you be home for dinner?" "Probably not. The Richardson situation is complicated." "I understand." I checked my watch again, 8:25 a.m. "I should get going. I need to stop by the florist before I reschedule my other appointments." "The florist?" David looked puzzled. "For the table arrangements. For the dinner party on Friday." The dinner party. We'd planned weeks ago, but which would never actually happen now. "Remember?" "Right." He nodded, clearly not remembering but unwilling to admit it. "The Anderson dinner." "Henderson," I corrected automatically, playing the role of attentive wife one last time. "George and Margaret Henderson." "Of course." He set down his mug and reached for his briefcase. "I should get to the office. See you at Mother's?" "I'll be there." As soon as I heard his car pull away, I moved into action, sending rapid-fire texts to Antoine and Claire on my secure phone, updating them on the change. "In plans. Lunch at Emile's house at 12:30. We'll proceed with 10 p.m. extraction as planned. Secure all documents and prepare for potential escalation." Claire's response was immediate. "Be careful. If they suspect anything, get out immediately. Antoine will be on standby all day." I spent the next 30 minutes making final preparations, checking that my essential documents were secure in my hidden safe, confirming my travel arrangements for that evening, ensuring the small overnight bag I'd prepared was concealed in the trunk of my car beneath a pile of Christmas decorations. At precisely 9 a.m., my secure phone buzzed with Michael's message. Transfer executed. Notifications dispatched. Account secured. It was done. The ancestral Blackwood home, the symbol of their dynasty, the physical manifestation of the legacy Evelyn had used to exclude and belittle me for 4 years, now legally belonged to Chimera Holdings, my anonymously owned company established through a complex web of LLCs and offshore entities. By the time the Blackwoods realized what had happened, I would be beyond their reach, and they would be facing both the imminent collapse of their company and the loss of their family home. I took a deep breath, a curious mix of vindication and sadness washing over me. Not sadness for what I'd done. They had earned this reckoning through years of manipulation and cruelty. But for the dreams I'd once had, the life I'd imagined building with David, before I understood the true nature of the Blackwood world. My phone rang. My regular phone this time. Evelyn, earlier than I'd expected. "Rebecca." Her voice was tight, controlled in that way that signaled barely suppressed fury. "You need to come to my house immediately. Not at 12:30. Now." "Evelyn, I have appointments this morning that I can't cancel them." The command was delivered with cold authority. "This is a family emergency." "What's happened? Is David all right?" "David is fine." Her tone suggested he was anything but fine. "This is about you, Rebecca. About what you've done." My pulse jumped, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. I think you are." The chill in her voice could have frozen the Atlantic. "You have 30 minutes to get here, or I'm calling our attorneys." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, heart pounding. They knew. Somehow they'd discovered my plan before the notification letters had even been delivered. But how? I'd been so careful, so meticulous in covering my tracks. I texted Antoine. Compromised. Mill knows. Moving to extraction immediately. His response was swift. En route. 20 minutes to your location. Standard extraction. Protocol. No time for the carefully planned evening departure. I needed to leave now, before the full weight of Blackwood retaliation came crashing down. I moved through the house quickly, grabbing my secure laptop, my document portfolio, and the small case of personal jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother. The only pieces that held genuine sentimental value among the designer baubles David had given me over the years. As I reached the garage, my phone rang again. David this time. I hesitated, then answered, keeping my voice calm. David, I was just about to call you. Your mother said there's some kind of emergency? Where are you? His voice was tightly controlled, a dangerous undercurrent I'd rarely heard from him. At home. I'm just leaving to meet you and your mother. Don't bother. The cold fury in, too. His tone was unmistakable now. We've seen the documents, Rebecca. We know what you've done. What documents? I asked, playing for time as I placed my belongings in the trunk of my car, next to the overnight bag. The property transfer. The notification just arrived at the firm. His voice rose. How could you do this? After everything my family has done. For you? Done for me? The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. What had the Blackwoods ever done for me except try to erase who I was, belittle my accomplishments, and treat me as an unwelcome intruder? I think we both know this marriage has been over for a long time, David. I kept my tone controlled, professional. I'm just making it official. By stealing our family home? The veneer of civility was cracking now, revealing the raw rage beneath. By threatening everything the Blackwood name stands for? Your family home? The one your father sold 20 years ago to cover his gambling debts? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice now. The one you've been pretending to own while actually leasing it back through shell companies? That family home? Silence. Then, how did you— I'm a financial analyst, David. Or I was, before I became your wife. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the inconsistencies in your family's financials? You had no right to look into our private matters. His voice had turned cold, calculating. This won't stand, Rebecca. Mother has already called Judge Patterson. We'll have an injunction by noon. Judge Patterson, Evelyn's tennis partner and devoted admirer. Of course she'd turn to him for emergency legal intervention. Good luck with that. I started my car, the engine purring to life. The property transfer is completely legal. Your family sold this house decades ago. I just purchased it from the holding company that actually owned it. With what money? He demanded. You haven't worked in 4 years. Where did you get the funds for something like this? Did you really think I liquidated all my investments when I married you? That I just handed over my financial independence, along with my career? I pulled out of the garage, checking the rearview mirror for any sign of Antoine's vehicle. I've been planning this for a long time, David. Ever since I found out about Cassandra. Another stunned silence. How did you know about your affair? The same way I knew about the others before her. I pay attention. Something you and your mother never bothered to do with me. A sleek black SUV turned into the driveway as I reached the end of it. Antoine, right on schedule. This isn't over, David said, his voice hardening with the entitled certainty of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. You won't get away with this. The Blackwoods protect their own. That's the thing, David, I replied, watching Antoine step out of his vehicle, his professional demeanor reassuring in its calm efficiency. I was never one of your own. Your mother made that perfectly clear. You'll never truly be part of this family, remember? Rebecca. Goodbye, David. I ended the call, slipping my phone into my purse as Antoine approached. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he confirmed, his expression betraying nothing. "We need to move quickly. My team reports activity at your mother-in-law's estate, suggesting private security. Mobilization. Of course, Evelyn would call in reinforcements. The Blackwoods wouldn't handle this embarrassment through normal legal channels if they could help it. I'm ready." I gestured to my car. "I'll follow you to the airfield?" He shook his head. "Too risky. Leave your vehicle. We'll use mine. Security protocols." I hesitated only briefly, glancing back at the Tudor mansion that had been my prison for 4 years. Everything that mattered was already in my trunk. The rest, the designer clothes, the Blackwood heirlooms, the trappings of a life that had never truly been mine, could stay behind. "Let's go," I said, helping Antoine transfer my essential bags to his vehicle. We were pulling away from the property when a familiar Mercedes turned sharply into the driveway, Evelyn, arriving far sooner than I'd anticipated. Our vehicles passed, each other at the gate, and for one electric moment, her eyes locked with mine through the tinted windows of Antoine's SUV. I couldn't be certain she recognized me, but the way her face hardened suggested she had. "We've been made," Antoine said calmly, accelerating smoothly as we hit the main road. "Plan B activated." He pressed a button on his steering wheel, and a voice responded through the vehicle's communication system. "Confirmed. Diversion team. Deployed. Private airfield access secured." Antoine caught my questioning glance in the rearview mirror. "Precautionary measures. Your mother-in-law has already contacted her security team. They'll be looking for your vehicle and commercial flight. Bookings under your name." "How do you know that?" A slight smile touched his lips. "We have ears in several security firms in Richmond, standard procedure for high-profile extractions." I sat back, a strange calm settling over me now that events were in motion. After years of planning, of maintaining the perfect Blackwood wife, facade while meticulously building my escape route, the actual moment of departure felt almost anticlimactic. "Your sister is standing by in Denver," Antoine continued, taking a series of turns that seemed designed to identify any potential tail. "Michael Green has executed the remaining financial transfers. All accounts are secure." "And the property? Notification?" I asked. "Has it been delivered to all the specified addresses?" "Confirmed at 9:17 a.m. Blackwood and Associates, your mother-in-law's residence, and the family attorney's office all received the documentation simultaneously." Antoine checked his mirrors before merging onto a less-traveled road heading away from the city. "The notification to the current occupants of the Tudor residence, that would be you and your husband, was scheduled for 10 a.m. delivery," I checked. My watch, 9:43 a.m. The courier would arrive to find no one home. A small disappointment. I'd hoped to be there when David received official notification that he no longer owned his ancestral home. But witnessing Evelyn's reaction at the gate had been satisfaction enough. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls from David, from Evelyn, from numbers I didn't recognize but guessed were Blackwood attorneys. I silenced it and placed it in my purse. That chapter of my life was closed. "How long to the airfield?" I asked, watching the Richmond cityscape recede in the side mirror. 28 minutes under normal conditions. We're taking an alternate route, so approximately 40. Antoine's driving was precise, professional. "Your chartered flight is being prepared. Wheels Up is scheduled for 11 a.m. Less than 2 hours from now, I would be airborne, leaving Virginia and the Blackwood legacy behind forever." The thought should have been exhilarating, but instead I felt a curious emptiness, not regret exactly, but a hollow acknowledgement. Of 4 years spent in an emotional wasteland, pretending to be someone I wasn't for a family that had never wanted me. "They'll try to stop the flight," I said, thinking aloud. "The Blackwoods have connections at all the major airports." "We're not using a major airport," Antoine replied. "The private airfield is owned by a client of ours. No Blackwood influence there." I nodded, trusting his expertise, but still scanning the road behind us for any sign of pursuit. The Blackwoods weren't accustomed to losing, especially not to someone they considered an outsider, an interloper in their rarefied world. My secure phone buzzed. Claire, checking in. Status update? I typed quickly. Extraction in progress. ETA Denver, 2:30 p.m. your time. B&E aware of property transfer. Full reaction protocol activated. Her response was swift. All systems go on this end. Legal team standing by. Security perimeter established. At safe house. Call when airborne. Your sister has been very thorough, Antoine observed, clearly having been briefed on Claire's preparations. The safe house location is secure, and your new identity documentation is ready. New identity. The final phase of my exit strategy. Not because I'd done anything illegal, but because I knew the Blackwoods would use every resource at their disposal to track me down, to inflict whatever retribution they could for the perceived betrayal of their family. Rebecca Collins died the moment she signed those property transfer documents, I said quietly. Time for Eleanor Wright to begin her life. Antoine nodded, understanding the reference to my new legal identity. Established over months through entirely legitimate channels, a complete paper trail built through an LLC registered in Wyoming, with connections to consulting work I genuinely performed during my sabbatical from finance. Eleanor Wright, financial consultant, he confirmed. New tax ID, new professional credentials, new credit history. Clean break. The countryside was opening up around us now, the rolling hills of Virginia stretching toward the horizon. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the December air flow across my face, carrying away the last vestiges of Rebecca Blackwood's carefully constructed persona. Private airfield ahead, Antoine announced, turning onto a narrow access road, partially concealed by pine trees. Final approach protocol initiated. He pressed another button on his console, and the vehicle's communication system activated again. Approach confirmed. Runway secure. No unauthorized personnel detected. The airfield came into view. A simple facility with a single runway, few hangars, and a sleek private jet waiting on the tarmac. Its engines already running. No commercial traffic, no TSA checkpoints, no manifests that could be traced through conventional channels. Antoine pulled up to a small security gate, exchanged a few words with the guard, and then proceeded directly to the waiting aircraft. A flight attendant stood at the bottom of the stairs, her professional smile revealing nothing about the unusual circumstances of this departure. "Ms. Wright," she greeted me as Antoine opened my door. "We're ready for boarding whenever you are. Your luggage will be loaded immediately." Eleanor Wright, my new name already in use, my new life beginning with this flight. "Thank you." I turned. To Antoine, extending my hand. "I appreciate your assistance." "Just doing my job, ma'am." He shook my hand firmly. "Your sister has my contact information if you need anything further." I nodded, then climbed the stairs into the aircraft, not looking back at Virginia, at the life I was leaving behind. The flight attendant showed me to my seat, a leather chair far more comfortable than the first-class accommodations I'd grown accustomed to as a Blackwood wife. "We'll be taking off shortly," she informed me. "The captain estimates a flight time of approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes to our destination. Can I get you anything before departure?" "Just water, thank you." I settled into my seat, watching through the window as Antoine supervised the loading of my few essential bags. My secure phone buzzed again. Michael this time. Blackwood attorneys attempting emergency injunction with Judge Patterson. Unlikely to succeed, given clean title transfer. All accounts secure. "Good luck, Rebecca." I smiled slightly at his use of my soon-to-be former name. Michael had been one of the few people in my life who had seen me, really seen me, for who I was, not who the Blackwoods had tried to shape me into being. "Thank you for everything, Michael." "Eleanor sends her regards." The cabin door closed, and the flight attendant announced our imminent departure. I fastened my seatbelt, closed my eyes, and focused on my breathing as the aircraft began to move. The past 4 years scrolled through my mind like scenes from someone else's life. The whirlwind courtship with David, the lavish wedding orchestrated entirely by Evelyn, the gradual erosion of my identity as I tried to fit into the Blackwood mold, the discovery of David's infidelity, the moment I found the financial documents that revealed the truth about the Blackwood empire. And finally, the catalyst, Evelyn's Christmas dinner last year, her voice carrying clearly across the table as she informed the assembled family that my barren condition was the greatest disappointment of her life. The moment when I'd realized that no matter what I did, no matter how perfectly I played the role of Blackwood wife, I would never be accepted. That night, I'd begun planning in earnest. Not just an exit from my marriage, but a complete dismantling of the facade the Blackwoods had maintained for decades. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, pressing me back into my seat as we lifted into the clear December sky. Below, Virginia receded, the landscape shrinking to a patchwork of fields and forests, the Blackwood world becoming smaller with each passing second until it was nothing but a memory. "Ms. Wright?" The flight attendant appeared with a bottle of water and a leather folio. "The captain has turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. You're free to move about the cabin. Also, this was left for you." I accepted the folio, waiting until she was gone before opening it. Inside was a single document, confirmation that the property transfer had been officially recorded with the county. The Tudor mansion, the symbol of Blackwood prestige for generations, now legally belonged to Chimera Holdings, my company. Along with the document was a handwritten note from Claire. "Welcome back to yourself. EW has a bright future ahead." I leaned back, a sense of completion washing over me. The Blackwoods had spent 4 years telling me I would never be family. Now, in ironic justice, they would spend years dealing with the consequences of underestimating the woman they'd tried to diminish. The aircraft banked gently westward, away from Richmond, away from the past, toward Colorado and the future I'd carefully constructed for myself. Eleanor Wright's future. The Blackwood Christmas retreat was in chaos. I didn't witness it firsthand, of course, but Claire's contacts provided detailed reports that she relayed to me in the secure comfort of her Denver penthouse in the days following my departure. Judge Patterson had indeed issued an emergency injunction at Evelyn's request, but it had been quickly overturned when my attorneys presented the clean chain of title proving the legal transfer of the property. The Blackwoods hadn't owned their ancestral home for 2 decades. They merely leased it through a complex series of holding companies to maintain the illusion of uninterrupted ownership. All I had done was purchase the property through legitimate channels, becoming their new landlord in the process. The 300% rent increase, effective immediately, payment due in full on January 1st, was entirely legal under the terms of the original lease agreement. The Richardson merger had collapsed spectacularly when news of the property transfer leaked to the financial press. A family unable to maintain ownership of its ancestral home didn't inspire confidence in potential business partners. Blackwood and Associates stock had plummeted, triggering margin calls on loans David and several senior partners had taken out, using their shares as collateral. "They're liquidating assets," Claire reported 3 days after my arrival in Denver, scrolling through updates on her tablet as we sat in her living room, the Rocky Mountains visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Evelyn's art collection, David's vintage car portfolio, the vacation properties in the Hamptons and Aspen. "And the Tudor?" I asked, sipping herbal tea from a mug that hadn't been selected by Evelyn Blackwood for its appropriate pedigree. "Still occupied, but they're scrambling to meet the January payment. Your attorneys delivered the formal eviction warning yesterday." She looked up, a hint of concern in her expression. "Are you sure you want to go through with this part? Forcing them out of the house seems, what? Cruel? Vindictive?" I set down my mug. After everything they did? Claire sighed. I'm just saying, you've already won. The property transfer exposed their financial house of cards. The company is in free fall. David's reputation is in tatters. Maybe let them keep the house? I considered her words, examining my own motivations. Was this about justice, or had it become about revenge? Had I become what the Blackwoods accused me of being, calculating, cold, using financial leverage to destroy those who had hurt me? It's not about punishment, I finally said. It's about consequences. For too long, the Blackwoods have used their name, their supposed prestige, to insulate themselves from the results of their actions. Evelyn spent 4 years reminding me I'd never be family, while David betrayed our marriage with a string of affairs. They need to face reality. And reality is becoming their landlord and tripling their rent? Claire's tone was gentle, but challenging. Reality is learning that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people as disposable accessories in your life without eventually paying a price. I gazed out at the mountains, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the winter sunlight. Besides, I'm not keeping the house. Once they're out, I'm donating it to the Historical Society, with the provision that it be maintained as a public museum dedicated to the architectural heritage of Richmond. Claire's eyebrows rose. You're giving away a multi-million-dollar property? Eleanor, Wright doesn't need an ancestral Virginia manor house. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. She has other plans for her future. Those plans were already taking shape. Using my financial expertise, skills that had lain dormant but not disappeared during my years as a Blackwood wife, I'd established a consulting firm specializing in helping women achieve financial independence after divorce or spousal death. The Eleanor Wright Foundation would provide grants and educational resources to women trapped in situations similar to what mine had been, offering pathways to freedom. Speaking of plans, Claire said, setting aside her tablet, Michael sent over the final divorce papers. David has been served, but he's refusing to sign. He'll sign. I felt oddly detached from the legal dismantling of my marriage. The emotional severing had happened long ago. Once he realizes the prenuptial agreement is invalidated by his infidelity, and that fighting me will only expose more Blackwood secrets to public scrutiny. And Evelyn? Any direct communication? I shook my head. Not with me. But apparently, she's been quite vocal among her social circle about her gold-digging daughter-in-law's betrayal. Classy as ever, Claire muttered. It doesn't matter. I stood, moving to the window to watch the sunset painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Evelyn Blackwood has no power over Eleanor Wright. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming message, an update from my legal team in Virginia. I scanned it quickly, then handed the phone to Claire. It's happening faster than we thought, I said as she read the message. David signed the divorce papers. Uncontested, all terms accepted. That's surprising. Claire looked up from the phone. What changed? According to his attorney's note, he wants to put this unfortunate chapter behind him and focus on rebuilding the Blackwood legacy. I couldn't keep the irony from my voice. Translation, he's cutting his losses. The family's in too much financial trouble to fight a legal battle they know they'll lose. So it's over? Claire asked. Just like that? Was it over? The marriage? Yes. The legal entanglements? Soon. But the echo of those years, the systematic diminishment, the casual cruelty, the gradual erosion of self-worth, those would take longer to fade. Not completely, I acknowledged. But I'm ready for whatever comes next. What came next, as it turned out, was an unexpected email from David, arriving on Christmas Eve, the day the Blackwood family retreat would normally have been in full swing, with its ritualized exclusion of those deemed not truly family. I hesitated before opening it, wondering if it contained more recriminations, more accusations, more attempts to make me feel guilty for the consequences of their own actions. Instead, I found something entirely unexpected. Rebecca, by the time you read this, the divorce will be finalized. I won't pretend to understand why you've done what you've done, but perhaps I deserve it. I wasn't the husband you deserved. You weren't the wife my mother wanted. We were both trapped in roles that didn't fit. I don't know where you are, and I won't try to find out. Mother is devastated naturally, but she'll survive. The Blackwoods always do, even if our circumstances are reduced for the foreseeable future. I thought you should know. There will be a child. Cassandra is pregnant, 3 months along. I would have told you before, but with everything happening. Perhaps this is for the best. A clean break for everyone. Mother doesn't know yet. One battle at a time. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that despite everything, I did love you. In my way. Not well enough, obviously. Not the way you deserved. Goodbye, Rebecca. I hope you find what you're looking for. David, I stared at the screen, a kaleidoscope of emotions swirling through me. A child. The heir Evelyn had wanted so desperately. The continuation of the Blackwood line that I had failed to provide. 3 months pregnant. Which meant Cassandra had been carrying David's child during all those family dinners where Evelyn had pointedly discussed my barrenness. During the nights, David came home late smelling of unfamiliar perfume. During the final weeks of my careful exit planning, I closed the email, set my phone down on Claire's granite countertop, and walked to the window. Snow was falling now, fat flakes drifting past the glass to join the growing blanket covering Denver. Clean, fresh snow, erasing the landscape and creating something new in its place. Bad news? Claire asked from the kitchen doorway, a mug of coffee in her hand. Not bad, exactly. Just unexpected. I turned to face her. Cassandra is pregnant, 3 months along. Claire's expression shifted from concern to surprise, then to something harder to define. How do you feel about that? It was the right question, the one I was asking myself. How did I feel? The answer surprised me. Relieved, I said, the truth of it settling into me as I spoke the word. They'll have their precious Blackwood heir. Evelyn will have her grandchild. And I gestured to the snowscape outside, to the mountains beyond, to the open future waiting for me. I have this. Freedom. A clean slate. Claire studied me for a moment, then nodded, accepting my answer. So what's next for Eleanor Wright? First, a proper Christmas. I smiled, feeling lighter somehow. No Blackwood formalities, no Evelyn judging my gift-wrapping skills, no pretense. Just family. Real family. I can manage that. Claire grinned. I even bought a pathetically small tree for your apartment, since you insisted on not staying here. Apartment? A sleek modern space in downtown Denver that couldn't have been more different from the Tudor mansion, was part of my fresh start. Claire had offered to let me stay with her indefinitely, but I'd needed my own space, my own sanctuary untouched by the past. And after Christmas? She prompted. The foundation launches in January. I have meetings set up with potential partners next week. I picked up my phone, dismissing David's email with a swipe. And I'm considering going back to school, maybe a PhD in economics. I've always wanted to teach. Professor Wright. Claire nodded approvingly. It suits you. It does, doesn't it? The idea had been percolating for weeks, a dream I'd set aside, when I became Rebecca Blackwood, but which Eleanor Wright could pursue without constraint. I think I'll apply for fall admission. Claire raised her mug in a toast. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, I echoed, feeling, for the first time, in years, genuinely hopeful about the future. The Denver winter passed in a blur of activity. The Eleanor Wright Foundation took shape, attracting favorable press and a roster of impressive board members. My consulting business established a solid client base. My PhD application was accepted at the University of Colorado, with a generous research stipend. Meanwhile, updates from Virginia painted a picture of the Blackwood Empire in disarray. The Tudor mansion stood empty after their failure to pay the January rent resulted in eviction proceedings. Blackwood and Associates was sold to a consortium of foreign investors who retained only the name, replacing all senior management. The Blue Ridge Mountain estate, where the annual Christmas retreat had been held, was on the market. I followed these developments with detached interest, like watching the final scenes of a movie I'd already walked out of. The Blackwoods' downfall wasn't my focus anymore. Building Eleanor Wright's future was. Spring arrived in Colorado, with a riot of wildflowers and crystalline blue skies. I was finalizing plans for the Foundation's first major initiative, a series of financial literacy workshops for women in transitional housing, when my secure phone buzzed with a message from my attorney in Virginia. Need to discuss new development. Available for call? I stepped out of the coffee shop where I'd been working and called him from a quiet corner of the adjacent park. Ms. Wright. Richard Gallagher's voice was cool and professional, giving nothing away. Thank you for calling back promptly. What's happened? I asked, watching a pair of sparrows squabble over crumbs beneath a nearby bench. I've received a rather unusual contact from Evelyn Blackwood's attorney. His tone remained carefully neutral. She's requesting a meeting. I blinked in surprise. With you? Or with you? Specifically with Eleanor Wright, though she's aware that's your new legal name. A chill ran through me despite the warm spring sunshine. How had Evelyn tracked me to Eleanor Wright? I'd been meticulously careful in establishing my new identity, creating a paper trail that couldn't be connected to Rebecca Collins or Rebecca Blackwood. How did she find me? I kept my voice steady, but my pulse had quickened. She didn't provide that information. Only that. She has a matter of mutual interest to discuss and is willing to travel to a neutral location of your choosing. Mutual interest. What could Evelyn Blackwood and Eleanor Wright possibly have in common at this point? The divorce was final. The property transfers were complete. The legal battles had been settled, mostly in my favor. There was nothing left to discuss. Unless... Is this about the child? I asked, the thought crystallizing suddenly. Cassandra's baby? She didn't specify, Richard replied. Only that it was a private family matter requiring direct communication. Family matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of Evelyn insisting I would never be family, she was now invoking that very connection to request a meeting. What do you advise? I asked, though I already knew what my answer would be. Professionally? Decline. There's no legal requirement for you to engage with Mrs. Blackwood at this point. He paused, then added more personally, but I've worked with you long enough to know you'll want all the information before making a decision. He was right. Despite everything, I was curious. What could be so important that Evelyn Blackwood would humble herself to request a meeting with the woman who had exposed her family's financial house of cards? Tell her I'll consider it, I decided. I need to know exactly what this is about before I agree to anything. Understood. I could hear him making notes. I'll request more specific information about the nature of the meeting. After ending the call, I sat on a park bench, watching Denver's downtown professionals hurry past in the late afternoon sunshine. My carefully constructed new life had been progressing exactly as planned. Did I really want to reopen the door to the Blackwoods, even just a crack? The answer came with surprising clarity. Yes, but on my terms. If Evelyn wanted to meet, it would be here, on my territory, with my terms clearly established in advance. Texted Claire. Evelyn requesting meeting. Considering agreeing with strict conditions. Thoughts? Her response was swift. Trap? Power play? Genuine need? Hard to tell with that woman. If you do it, full security, public place, I'm there too. She was right to be cautious. Evelyn Blackwood wasn't accustomed to losing, and she might see this as an opportunity to reassert some control over the situation. Or over me. I called Richard back. I'll meet with her, under these conditions, public location of my choosing. In Denver, security present but discreet, my sister in attendance, and a clear agenda provided in advance. I'll convey your terms, he replied. Don't be surprised if she counters. But Evelyn didn't counter. Within hours, Richard called back to report that she had accepted all my conditions without argument and could be in Denver as soon as the following week. She's also provided the agenda, he added, a note of surprise in his voice. It's about the child. Cassandra's pregnancy is complicated. She says you'll understand why this concerns you when you meet. Complicated. That single word sent a chill through me. What could be complicated about Cassandra's pregnancy that would involve me? I'd signed away all legal connections to the Blackwoods in the divorce settlement, unless David had lied about the timing, unless the child was conceived before our separation, unless there were paternity questions that somehow implicated me in the legal proceedings. I pushed these speculations aside. 1 week. I could maintain my equilibrium for 1 week until I heard whatever Evelyn had to say. Set it up, I told Richard. Next Wednesday, 11 a.m. at the Botanical Gardens Cafe. Public enough to prevent a scene. Private enough for a sensitive conversation. I'll make the arrangements, he confirmed. And Ms. Wright, be careful. The Evelyn Blackwood I've encountered in legal proceedings isn't accustomed to asking for anything. If she's requesting this meeting, it must be significant, I finished for him. I know, I'll be prepared. The week passed with excruciating slowness. I threw myself into work, finalizing the Foundation's summer programs, attending meetings, with potential donors, preparing for my PhD coursework, which would begin in September. But Evelyn's impending visit lurked at the edges of my consciousness, an unwelcome intrusion from a past I'd worked so hard to leave behind. Claire accompanied me to the Botanical Gardens that Wednesday, Antoine following discreetly at a distance to provide security. We arrived early, choosing a table with clear sightlines to all entrances and exits, positioning ourselves so that Evelyn would have to approach across open ground. You're sure about this? Claire asked as we waited, both of us nursing cups of herbal tea. It's not too late to cancel, I'm sure. I straightened the sleeve of my silk blouse. Eileen Fisher, not the St. John that Evelyn had always insisted was the only appropriate brand for a Blackwood wife. Whatever this is about, I want to know. Here she comes. Claire nodded toward the garden entrance. And she's alone. Evelyn Blackwood walked toward us with the regal bearing of a woman who had spent her life expecting the world to accommodate her preferences. But there were changes since I'd last seen her 5 months ago. She looked thinner, the tailored Chanel suit hanging slightly loose on her frame. Lines had deepened around her mouth and eyes. Her hair, still perfectly colored and styled, seemed somehow less lustrous. She spotted us and altered her course slightly, heading directly to our table. I remained seated, refusing to stand in deference as I once would have. Claire shifted subtly, a protective gesture that warmed me even as I maintained my composed expression. Rebecca. Evelyn stopped before our table, her voice carrying the familiar, crisp authority, though perhaps with a new undertone I couldn't quite identify. Eleanor, I corrected calmly. Thank you for agreeing to meet here, Mrs. Blackwood. This is my sister, Claire Collins. We've met. Evelyn nodded curtly to Claire, who returned the gesture with equal coolness. At your wedding. Please sit. I gestured to the empty chair opposite us. Would you like some tea? The lavender blend is excellent. A flash of irritation crossed her features. She'd always considered herbal tea to be beneath the dignity of a proper hostess, but she masked it quickly. No, thank you. I prefer to address the matter at hand directly. By all means. I folded my hands on the table, waiting. Evelyn glanced at Claire, a clear indication that she preferred a private conversation, but I made no move to ask my sister to leave. After a moment, Evelyn accepted the reality of the situation and opened the slim leather portfolio she carried. I assume David told you about Cassandra's pregnancy, she began, her tone clipped. He mentioned it in an email, yes. I kept my expression neutral. 3 months along at Christmas, which would make her nearly 7 months now. The information was incorrect. Evelyn removed a document from her portfolio and placed it on the table between us. This is Cassandra's medical record, which she has authorized me to share with you. The conception date was earlier than initially believed. I glanced at the document, noting the Richmond Memorial Hospital letterhead and Cassandra's name at the top. The estimated conception date was highlighted, July 15th of last year. More than 9 months ago now. I see. I looked up, meeting Evelyn's gaze. But I fail to understand how this involves me. David and I have been divorced for months. His child, with Cassandra, is none of my concern. The child isn't David's. Evelyn's voice was flat, emotionless. Genetic testing has confirmed it. I blinked, genuinely surprised. Then I'm even more confused about why you're here. Evelyn's perfectly manicured hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her portfolio. The child is biologically related to the Blackwood family, just not through David. Claire shifted beside me, her posture becoming more alert. What exactly are you saying, Mrs. Blackwood? Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on me. William Blackwood, David's cousin, is the father. He and Cassandra have apparently been involved for some time. When the prenatal genetic testing raised questions about paternity, a DNA test was performed. The results were conclusive. William, David's cousin who worked in the London office of Blackwood and Associates, the one who had always seemed uncomfortable around me at family gatherings, who had avoided Evelyn's matchmaking attempts with various socially appropriate young women. That's unfortunate, I said carefully, still not understanding why this warranted a cross-country trip to meet with me. But again, how does this concern me? Because, Evelyn said, removing another document from her portfolio, the child has been diagnosed with a rare congenital heart defect, one that requires specialized treatment that is experimental and not covered by insurance. The second document was a medical report detailing the condition, hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a complex defect where the left side of the heart is critically underdeveloped. I scanned the treatment recommendations, the prognosis without intervention, the estimated costs. The best surgical team is here in Denver, Evelyn continued, her voice losing some of its practiced control. At Children's Hospital, the waiting list is extensive, but there's a private option available for those who can afford it. And suddenly, with perfect clarity, I understood why Evelyn Blackwood had flown across the country to meet with the woman who had exposed her family's financial house of cards. You need money, I said quietly. The Blackwood fortune is gone. The assets liquidated, the company sold, and now you need funds for the child's treatment. A flicker of something, anger, humiliation, desperation, crossed her face before she composed it again into its familiar mask of aristocratic control. Yes. The single word seemed to cost her physically, as if admitting need was an alien concept requiring unfamiliar muscles. The family resources are constrained at present. William has some funds, but nowhere near enough for the full treatment protocol. Cassandra's family has modest means. David has contributed what he can, but with the company's situation, she trailed off, leaving the extent of the Blackwood financial collapse unspoken between us. And you thought I would help? I kept my voice neutral, genuinely curious about her reasoning. After everything that happened? I thought you might consider it, Evelyn replied, meeting my gaze directly. Not for me, Not for David, not even for the Blackwood name, but for an innocent child who never asked to be born into this situation. Claire leaned forward slightly. Why not approach traditional funding sources? Medical charities, crowdfunding? Blackwoods. Do not beg publicly for assistance, Evelyn said stiffly, the old pride reasserting itself. And the child's situation is delicate. William is married, though separated. There are complications beyond the medical ones. Of course, the Blackwood reputation, the family image, still paramount even in financial ruin. The scandal of William's infidelity, of a Blackwood heir born to a woman who had been publicly linked to David, it would be the final blow to a legacy already in tatters. I studied Evelyn carefully, noting the fine tension lines around her mouth, the slight tremble in her hands that she tried to hide by clasping them firmly together. This wasn't the imperious matriarch who had spent 4 years reminding me of my inadequacies. This was a woman brought low by circumstances, forced to seek help from the very person she had most thoroughly rejected. The irony of this situation isn't lost on me, I said finally. For years, you made it clear I would never be family. Now you're asking for my help for a Blackwood child. Evelyn's chin lifted slightly, pride battling with necessity. Yes. No excuses, no justifications, no attempt to rewrite history. Just the simple acknowledgement of her request and the implicit recognition of its audacity. I glanced at Claire, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though I could read the wariness in her eyes. She was concerned I might be manipulated. By Evelyn, drawn back into the Blackwood web by a calculated appeal to my compassion. The Eleanor Wright Foundation does have a medical assistance program, I said slowly, watching Evelyn's reaction. We provide grants for women and children in need of specialized care not covered by traditional insurance. A flicker of hope crossed her face, quickly masked. I see. However, I continued, our grants are based on financial need, transparent, documentation, and a lack of alternative resources. The process requires full disclosure of all family finances and exhaustion of other potential funding sources. Full disclosure. Evelyn repeated the words as if they tasted foreign on her tongue. Of Blackwood finances. Complete and verifiable, I confirmed. Our board has strict requirements. No exceptions. Even for family? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and I saw the moment she realized what she'd said, the contradiction of her years of insistence that I was not, could never be family. Especially for family, I replied evenly, to avoid any appearance of favoritism or impropriety. Claire shifted beside me, her leg pressing gently against mine in silent support. She understood what I was doing, not rejecting Evelyn outright, but establishing clear boundaries and conditions. Making it clear that any help would come from Eleanor Wright, the foundation director, not Rebecca Blackwood, the rejected daughter-in-law. Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her internal struggle playing out in the tiny muscle movements around her eyes, the subtle tightening of her jaw. Pride versus necessity, Blackwood tradition versus the reality of a child's medical needs. What would this disclosure entail? She finally asked, her voice controlled but strained. Everything. I removed a business card from my purse and placed it on the table beside her medical documents. Tax returns for all involved parties, bank, statements, investment accounts, real estate holdings, outstanding debts, a complete picture of the family's financial position. Some of that information is sensitive. All grant applications are handled with strict confidentiality, I assured her. Only the Foundation's Financial Review Committee would see the documentation, and they're bound by non-disclosure agreements. And if we meet these requirements? Evelyn asked, her fingers lightly touching the edge of my business card but not yet taking it. What assistance might be available? The foundation could cover up to 70% of uncovered medical expenses, depending on the financial assessment and treatment protocol. I kept my tone professional, as if this were any other grant application and not a request from the woman who had once told me my greatest failure was my inability to produce a Blackwood heir. The remaining 30% would need to come from family resources or other funding sources. Evelyn nodded slowly, processing this information. And the timeline for a decision? Expedited given the medical urgency. 2 weeks from receipt of all required documentation. She finally picked up my card, slipping it into her portfolio. I will discuss this with the family. William and Cassandra will need to agree to the disclosure requirements. Of course. I stood, signaling the end of our meeting. My contact information is on the card. The Foundation's financial director will need to speak directly with all parties involved. Evelyn rose as well, her posture stiff, but her expression less certain than I'd ever seen it. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something more personal, something beyond the transactional nature of our discussion. But the moment passed, and her features settled back into their familiar composed mask. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said formally. "I'll be in touch." With a slight nod to Claire, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate, her back ramrod straight, the perfect Blackwood matriarch to any casual observer. But I had seen the cracks in the facade, the desperation behind the request, the humiliation of having to ask for help from the woman she had so thoroughly rejected. "Well," Claire said once Evelyn was out of earshot, "that was unexpected." Was it? I sank back into my chair, suddenly feeling the emotional weight of the encounter. Isn't this exactly how it would play out? The Blackwoods need something from me, so suddenly I'm worth acknowledging. "You don't have to help them, you know." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. The Foundation could find a dozen other families just as deserving without the toxic history. I know. I watched a butterfly dance among the nearby flowering plants, its wings catching the sunlight as it moved from bloom to bloom. But this isn't about the Blackwoods. It's about a child with hypoplastic left heart syndrome who needs specialized care. A child who is no relation to you, Claire pointed out. A child whose grandmother spent years making you feel worthless for not producing a Blackwood heir. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all Evelyn's emphasis on bloodlines and family legacy, she was now seeking help for a child who would be considered illegitimate by her precious social circle. A child born of betrayal, not just William's infidelity to his wife, but Cassandra's betrayal of David, even if their relationship had been built on mutual deception. "The child is innocent," I said. Finally. Whatever I think of the Blackwoods, that baby didn't choose its circumstances. Claire studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You've already decided to help." "If they meet the Foundation's requirements, yes." I gathered my purse, ready to leave the gardens and the lingering spectral presence of Evelyn Blackwood behind. But on my terms, Eleanor Wright's terms. Not as a supplicant welcomed back into the Blackwood fold because they suddenly need something from me. As we walked toward the exit, Antoine falling into step at a discreet distance behind us, I felt a curious lightness. The encounter I had dreaded had instead become a moment of power, not the destructive power of revenge that had driven my property acquisition, but the constructive power of making a clear-eyed choice from a position of strength. "You know," Claire said as we reached her car, "there's something almost biblical about this, the rejected stone becoming the cornerstone." "I prefer to think of it as karma," I replied, sliding into the passenger seat. "The universe has a sense of humor if you wait long enough to see the punchline." 3 days later, my secure phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. The text was brief and unsigned, but I knew immediately who it was from. "We will. Comply with all requirements. William and Cassandra have been informed. Where should documentation be sent? Evelyn." using a personal phone rather than going through official channels or attorneys. A tacit acknowledgement that this was now personal, not legal. I sent back the Foundation's secure document portal information, adding, "Claire Collins is our financial director. She will handle the review personally to ensure confidentiality." The response came almost immediately. "Understood. Thank you." Two simple words that must have cost Evelyn Blackwood dearly. The woman who had once commanded Richmond society, who had orchestrated mergers and acquisitions over afternoon tea, who had made it her life's work to maintain the illusion of Blackwood, prosperity and prominence, reduced to thanking the woman she had spent years belittling for access to medical care for her grandchild. Claire called that evening, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. The first batch of documents came through. "Rebecca, it's worse than we thought." "How bad?" I asked, setting aside the research papers I'd been reviewing for my upcoming PhD program. "They're completely underwater. The Tudor mansion was just the tip of the iceberg. Every property, every investment, every account, leveraged to the hilt or already liquidated. David's working as a sales director for a mid-sized insurance firm. William's wife is divorcing him and demanding half of assets that no longer exist. Evelyn's living in a 2-bedroom condo that belongs to her sister." I closed my eyes, imagining the humiliation Evelyn must be experiencing. Her entire identity had been built around Blackwood prominence, around being the matriarch of a dynasty. Now that dynasty was reduced to scraping together funds for medical care, to living in borrowed or rented accommodations, to rebuilding from scratch. "And the child's medical needs?" I asked, focusing on what mattered. "Significant. The documentation confirms everything Evelyn said. The baby, a girl by the way, will need at least 3 surgeries over the first few years of life, possibly more depending on how she responds to treatment. The total cost without insurance coverage is just under $2 million. I whistled softly. "That's at the upper end of our grant parameters." "We can cover 70% as you outlined," Claire confirmed. "But even the remaining 30% is going to be a stretch for them. William's starting over at an entry-level position with a financial firm in Boston. Cassandra's on unpaid maternity leave from a paralegal job. David's contributing monthly, but his new position pays about a quarter of what he made at Blackwood and Associates." I considered this information, turning it over in my mind. The Foundation could technically cover the full amount. I had endowed it with enough of my personal funds to handle special cases. But I had told Evelyn 70%, establishing a boundary, making it clear this wasn't a blank check from a family member, but a formal grant from a professional organization. Stick with the 70%, I decided. But we can help them. Identify other funding sources for the remainder. Children's hospitals often have auxiliary foundations for cases like this. "Are you sure?" Claire's voice held a note of concern. "No one would fault you for covering the whole amount. It's your foundation, your money, I'm sure." I moved to my apartment window, looking out at the Denver skyline glittering against the night sky. This isn't about punishing the Blackwoods anymore. It's about maintaining healthy boundaries. They need to do their part. All right. I could hear Claire making notes. "I'll draft the official grant letter tomorrow. Standard terms, 70% of approved medical expenses paid directly to the providers, monthly statements required, periodic review of the family's financial situation." Perfect. I hesitated, then added, "And Claire, include a personal note with the letter, just saying that I hope the baby does well with her treatment." "That's generous of you," Claire observed quietly. Was it generous, or was it simply human? I wasn't sure anymore where the line between justice and mercy lay in this situation. The Blackwoods had hurt me deeply, had tried to diminish me and mold me into someone I wasn't. But continuing to hurt them wouldn't undo that damage or heal those wounds. It would just perpetuate the cycle. "It's what Eleanor Wright would do," I said finally. "And I'm Eleanor Wright now." The baby was born 2 weeks later, 2 months premature, her tiny heart already struggling with its congenital defect. Claire forwarded me the clinical update that came with the first request for fund disbursement. 4.2 pounds, immediate transfer to the neonatal intensive care unit. Surgical intervention planned as soon as she was stable enough. They had named her Elizabeth. Claire Blackwood. The middle name couldn't be coincidence. It had to be an acknowledgement, not just of Claire's role in facilitating the foundation grant, but of the Collins sisters' place in the child's story. I sent a simple white orchid to the hospital with a card signed Eleanor Wright, Executive Director, rather than any personal message. Professional, appropriate, maintaining the boundaries I had established. But I included my private email address, handwritten on the back of the card, an opening, should Cassandra want to communicate, directly. She did, 2 days later. A simple message with a photo attached, Elizabeth Clare, Day 3. First surgery scheduled for tomorrow. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have right now. Thank you, Rebecca. Or Eleanor, whichever you prefer to be for her. The photo showed a tiny infant in an incubator, tubes and wires connecting her to monitors and medication pumps, her skin translucent, her eyes closed. So vulnerable, so innocent of the complicated adult world she had been born into. I stared at the image for a long time before responding. Eleanor is fine. I'm glad the foundation could help. Sending positive thoughts for tomorrow's surgery. Please keep me updated on her progress if you feel comfortable. Doing so, Cassandra's reply came quickly, I will. And, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better from all of us. An apology I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I needed anymore. The woman I was now, Eleanor Wright, PhD student, foundation director, financial consultant, had built a life that felt authentic and purposeful in a way that Rebecca Blackwood's life never had. The wounds inflicted by the Blackwoods were healing, the scars fading. I closed my laptop without responding to Cassandra's apology. Some things didn't need acknowledgement or closure. Some things could simply be allowed to fade into the past, making room for whatever came next. And what came next, over the following months, was an unexpected evolution in my relationship with the child whose existence had brought Evelyn Blackwood to my door. Elizabeth Clare's first surgery was successful, though her recovery was complicated by a minor infection. Her second procedure was scheduled for her 3-month mark, assuming she continued to gain weight and strength. Cassandra sent weekly updates, brief, factual reports on Elizabeth's progress, occasionally accompanied by photos. I responded with equally brief messages of encouragement. We developed a cautious, distant relationship centered entirely on the child's medical journey. She never mentioned David or Evelyn or the broader Blackwood family, and I never asked. Until 6 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, she included a different kind of message. Evelyn visited yesterday. First time since the birth. She brought the family christening gown, apparently some priceless Blackwood heirloom that survived the financial collapse. She seemed different. Humbled, maybe? She asked about you, about Eleanor. I think she wanted to know if we were in contact. I told her the truth, that you receive medical updates as part of the grant requirements. Nothing more, nothing less. Hope that was okay. I read the message several times, trying to imagine Evelyn in a hospital room, holding the tiny granddaughter born of circumstances that would have scandalized her former social circle. The family christening gown, one of the few tangible connections to the Blackwood legacy that remained. A peace offering. An attempt to incorporate this unexpected child into the family traditions? Or simply a grandmother's natural desire to establish a connection with her grandchild? My response was careful. That's fine. The foundation only requires medical updates relevant to treatment covered by the grant. Any personal communication is entirely at your discretion. Cassandra seemed to understand my implied boundaries. Understood. Medical updates only from now on. Elizabeth's next evaluation is scheduled for Tuesday, and so our communication returned to its previous pattern. Clinical updates, brief acknowledgments, the occasional photo showing Elizabeth's slow but steady progress. The arrangement was working. The boundaries were clear. Eleanor Wright was helping a child in need through her foundation, nothing more. Until the day I received a handwritten letter, delivered to my foundation office, addressed in an elegant script I recognized immediately. Eleanor, I. Write this knowing I have no right to expect it will be read, much less answered. But there are things that must be said, even if only to the silent page. Elizabeth Clare has survived her second surgery. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. She has your eyes, though of course that is merely coincidence. The same clear gaze that sees through pretense. I suspect I find myself thinking often of our last conversation at your husband's gallery opening. Do you remember? You spoke of creating a legacy beyond bloodlines. I dismissed your words as the naive idealism of a woman who didn't understand the importance of family, of tradition, of names that echo through history. I was wrong. The Blackwood name continues, yes. Elizabeth Clare carries it. But the legacy I spent my life protecting was built on illusion, on appearances maintained at the cost of substance, on pride that became arrogance, on tradition that became rigidity. Your foundation, your real legacy, has done more genuine good in months than the Blackwood name accomplished in generations. While we were preserving facades, you were building something of true value. I will never be able to undo the harm I caused you. The small cruelties, the calculated exclusions, the persistent message that you would never be family. I offer no excuses, only the acknowledgement that I was wrong, and that the price of that wrongness has been paid not just by you, but by all of us. The doctors say Elizabeth will need ongoing care throughout her childhood. Your foundation's support makes this possible. I find it a peculiar justice that the child I hoped would never exist, a Blackwood heir not of your bearing, now exists because of your generosity. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I ask only that you know that I understand now what you tried to tell me years ago. Family is not defined by blood or name or tradition. It is defined by love, by care, by the willingness to put another's needs before your own pride. With deepest respect and regret, Evelyn Blackwood, I folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope. The elegant stationery, clearly not the customary Blackwood monogrammed paper, spoke volumes about Evelyn's changed circumstances. Even her signature looked different somehow. Less imperious, more human. For 3 days, the letter sat on my desk at home, unanswered. I wasn't sure what response, if any, was appropriate. Evelyn wasn't asking for anything, wasn't seeking absolution or renewed connection. She was simply acknowledging truths that must have been painful for her to face. On the 4th day, I made a decision that surprised even me. I contacted Antoine and arranged for a discreet security presence, then booked a flight to Richmond. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked when I told her my plans. "Going back there, seeing them face to face?" "I'm not going to see them," I corrected her. "I'm going to see Elizabeth." Children's Hospital of Richmond was a modern facility, with cheerful murals decorating the corridors and a quiet efficiency that spoke of serious medicine delivered with compassion. I identified myself at the reception desk as Eleanor Wright, executive director of the foundation supporting Elizabeth. Blackwood's care. The staff, familiar with the foundation's role in the case, directed me to the pediatric cardiac wing. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Not Cassandra, not William, certainly not Evelyn or David. This visit wasn't about them. It was about seeing firsthand the child whose existence had unexpectedly reconnected me to a past I thought I'd left behind completely. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, met me in the family consultation room, reviewing Elizabeth's case with professional detachment. "She's doing remarkably well, all things considered," she explained, showing me charts and test results. "The second surgery was more successful than we anticipated. She'll need at least one more major procedure before she's 5, but her prognosis is considerably better than our initial assessment." "And her day-to-day care?" I asked, scanning the detailed reports. "Intensive, but manageable. Her mother has been trained in all necessary procedures. The grandmother has completed the training as well. Evelyn, learning medical procedures, taking an active role in Elizabeth's care. The woman who had once refused to discuss anything as undignified as bodily functions, who had delegated even the most basic childcare tasks to nannies and housekeepers when David was young." "Is the family here today?" I tried to keep my tone casual, professional. "Ms. Porter is here now. Mrs. Blackwood, the grandmother, usually comes in the evenings." Dr. Martinez checked her watch. "Would you like to see the patient? As a representative of the foundation, you're authorized for brief visits with parental consent." I hesitated, suddenly uncertain. I had flown across the country, had arranged security, had prepared myself mentally for this encounter, but now that the moment was here, I felt a flutter of anxiety. What was I hoping to find in the face of this child? Closure? Connection? Some kind of resolution to the complicated tangle of emotions the Blackwoods still evoked? "Yes," I said finally. "I'd like to see her, if Miss Porter consents, of course." Dr. Martinez stepped out to check with Cassandra, returning a few minutes later with a guarded nod. "She's agreed to a brief visit. Room 412, just down the hall." The walk to Elizabeth's room felt longer than it should have. Each step carried me closer to a confrontation, not with the Blackwoods, but with my own unresolved feelings about the past 4 years. About what I had gained and lost. About who I had become in the process. The door to room 412 was partially open. I knocked gently, then stepped inside. The room was bright with afternoon sunlight, decorated with colorful mobiles and stuffed animals. Medical equipment hummed quietly, monitoring but no longer actively, intervening, and there, in a hospital crib modified for a cardiac patient, lay Elizabeth Clare Blackwood. 3 months old now, still tiny but no longer fragile-looking. Her wispy dark hair framed a face that was uniquely her own. Not Blackwood, not Porter, just Elizabeth. Cassandra stood by the crib, her hand resting protectively near her daughter's foot. She looked different from the woman I'd glimpsed occasionally. During my marriage, less polished, more authentic somehow. Motherhood and crisis had stripped away pretenses. "Rebecca," she acknowledged quietly. "Or should I call you Eleanor now?" "Eleanor is fine." I remained near the door, maintaining a respectful distance. "Thank you for allowing this visit. I wanted to see how she's doing in person. The foundation has been everything." Cassandra's voice wavered slightly. "Without it, without you." I raised a hand, stopping her. "The foundation exists to help children like Elizabeth. There's no need for—" "Yes, there is." She straightened, meeting my eyes directly. "There is every need. You could have refused. After what we did, what I did, you had every right to turn your back on us completely." I moved a few steps closer to the crib, looking down at Elizabeth. Her eyes were open, dark blue and alert, tracking the colorful mobile above her. One tiny hand was wrapped around a monitoring wire as if examining it. "She's curious," I observed, avoiding Cassandra's implied question about my motivations. "Like her father." Cassandra smiled faintly. "William always needs to understand how things work. Not a trait I associated with any Blackwood I had known, but perhaps William was different from David and Evelyn in ways I hadn't had the opportunity to observe." "The doctors say she's doing well," I said. "Better than expected." "She's a fighter." Cassandra's voice held a fierce pride. Whatever else she inherited from the Blackwoods, she got their stubbornness. their refusal to concede defeat. I smiled despite myself. That much I recognize. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds Elizabeth's small noises and the quiet beep of monitors. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, just a pause, a space between what had been and what might be. Evelyn visits every evening, Cassandra said finally. She's different now. The collapse, the scandal, Elizabeth's condition, it's changed her. So her letter suggested. I kept my tone neutral. She doesn't know I told you this, but she sits here reading to Elizabeth for hours. Classic literature, French poetry, even medical journals about cardiac care. She says she wants Elizabeth to know there's more to being a Blackwood than social standing or financial success. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. That doesn't sound like the Evelyn I knew. It's not. Cassandra adjusted Elizabeth's blanket with gentle hands. None of us are who we were before all this happened. You saw to that. There was no accusation in her voice, just a simple acknowledgement of truth. My actions had catalyzed the collapse of the Blackwood empire, exposing the rot beneath the gilded exterior. The consequences had been far-reaching, affecting lives beyond just David and Evelyn. And you don't resent that? I asked, curious despite myself. Cassandra considered the question, her gaze on her daughter. How can I? Elizabeth exists because of choices we all made, good and bad. William and I betrayed David. You exposed the family's financial lies. Evelyn's pride prevented her from acknowledging problems until it was too late. We all played our parts. She looked up, meeting my eyes again. But Elizabeth is innocent of all that. She's just a baby who needs specialized care that wouldn't be possible without your foundation. So no, I don't resent what you did. I'm grateful for what you're doing now. I nodded, accepting her assessment. It aligned with my own feelings, that the past was past, that continuing cycles of blame and retribution served no one, that Elizabeth deserved a chance untainted by the complicated history of the adults in her life. May I? I gestured toward Elizabeth, asking permission to touch her. Cassandra nodded, stepping back slightly to give me room. I reached down, gently stroking Elizabeth's cheek with one finger. Her skin was soft, warm with life and possibility. She turned toward the touch, blinking up at me with those serious blue eyes. Not Blackwood eyes, not Colin's eyes, just her own. Hello, Elizabeth, I said softly. It's nice to finally meet you. She made a small gurgling sound, her tiny hand waving in the air. I offered my finger, and she grasped it with surprising strength. In that moment, standing in a Richmond hospital room holding the finger of a child who by all rights should have been nothing to me, I felt the last pieces of Rebecca Blackwood's pain and anger dissolve. Not forgotten, never that, but transformed. Into something else, something that looked forward rather than back. Elizabeth Clare Blackwood would never be my child, never be my blood relation, never be my legal or familial responsibility. But she represented something I hadn't expected to find when I boarded that plane to Richmond. A bridge between past and future, a reminder that legacies aren't defined by names or bloodlines, but by choices and connections. She likes you, Cassandra observed. She's too young to have preferences, I replied automatically, then smiled at my own pedantry. But I like her too. I gently disengaged my finger from Elizabeth's grasp, stepping back toward the door. I had seen what I came to see. The child was well, receiving excellent care, surrounded by people who, whatever their past failings, clearly loved her deeply. Will you tell Evelyn I was here? I asked, pausing at the threshold. Cassandra considered this. Do you want me to? Did I? I wasn't sure. Evelyn's letter had been honest, vulnerable in a way I'd never witnessed from her. But I wasn't ready for a face-to-face reunion, wasn't sure I ever would be. Yes, I decided. Tell her I received her letter. and that Elizabeth is beautiful. Nothing else? I shook my head. That's enough for now. As I walked out of the hospital into the bright Virginia afternoon, I felt a sense of completion. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge fulfilled, but the quieter peace of a chapter closing gently, making room for whatever came next. Eleanor Wright boarded a plane back to Denver that evening, leaving Richmond and the Blackwoods behind once more. But this departure was different from the desperate extraction of months before. This time, I left not as someone fleeing a toxic past, but as someone who had faced that past on her own terms and found it no longer held power over her present. The Eleanor Wright Foundation would continue supporting Elizabeth's medical care. Cassandra would continue sending updates. Life would move forward for all of us, changed, humbled perhaps, but also freed from the weight of pretense and false legacy. Evelyn had been wrong all those years. I would never be family, not in the narrow, bloodline-obsessed way she had defined it, but in the ways that truly mattered, in compassion, in connection, in shared humanity. Perhaps we had finally found something close to understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Some wounds go too deep for that simple healing. But it was something equally powerful. The recognition that the opposite of love isn't hate, but indifference. And I was no longer indifferent to the Blackwoods' fate, no longer defined by my reaction to their rejection. Eleanor Wright held the deed to the Blackwood ancestral home. But more importantly, she held the key to her own future, a future built on her terms, shaped by her values, free from the shadows of a past that had once seemed inescapable. As the plane lifted into the clouds, I opened my laptop to review the Foundation's latest projects. There was work to be done, a PhD program to prepare for, a life to live. My life. Eleanor Wright's life. At last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.